The English had their eyes on the new Netherland territory in the Americas from the moment it began. But when New England made serious plans to seize the colony from the Dutch, Old England, unhappy with New England's increasing sense of independence, would do the job themselves as part of their grand operation to end the Dutch trade monopoly. The West India Company, in charge of the colony, apparently believed that Director-General Pieter Stuyvesant could simply talk the English out of their hostile takeover because they didn't assist with troops or money. I am Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to the 9th and final episode of the story of New Amsterdam, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. If you've enjoyed this series, especially the 70% of you who watch this on your TV, please leave a like and a comment of 7 words or more. It would help boost the series so much. And don't forget to subscribe for future videos, like the upcoming special The Pirates of New Amsterdam. As always, information about the sources, the music, and ways to support the channel are linked in the description. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. The weather was great when the 4-ship English fleet sailed from Portsmouth in Old England to Boston in New England. However, on day 16, the fleet was hit by crosswinds, foul weather, and a very great fog. The commander in charge of the expedition, Colonel Richard Nichols, on his flagship, the 36-gun Guinea, even lost sight of 2 of his ships. 10 weeks after leaving Portsmouth, the English fleet arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. 2 ships landed on Cape Cod, the other 2 to the south at Piscataway. Nichols sent riders to the New England governors to deliver letters with orders from King Charles II of England for the welfare and advancement of those our plantations in America. They had to join and assist vigorously in reducing the Dutch to subjection. The New Englanders were like, I don't know, and found a bunch of excuses to be excused from the military expedition. These hardcore Puritans weren't exactly fans of the Anglican royal family. They'd fled Old England's religious persecution to start a city upon a hill. If the King of England conquered the Dutch, he might demand they adopt religious freedom as well. Ew. Meanwhile, the governor of Connecticut, John Winthrop Jr., was super enthusiastic. At first, he figured New Netherland would be added to his territory as per the charter handed to him personally by King Charles. Then he heard the king had reneged on Connecticut's charter deal, and just like that, Winthrop's dream of a continent-wide Connecticut colony went up in smoke. But the man handled it like a champ, switched gears, and offered all the help in negotiating with Director-General Stuyvesant. Nichols was like, welcome aboard. Around August 20th, 1664, the English squadron anchored in the bay between New Utrecht and Konijnen-eiland, Rabbit Island, now Coney Island, cutting off all communication between Long Island and Manhattan. They also seized several vessels. About 3 miles away, on Staten Island on the other side of the bay, stood the company's small 20-foot square blockhouse fort. It had been constructed for defense against the Indians, not the heavily armed English. It had 2 small guns carrying 1-pound balls and a garrison of 6 old invalid soldiers. The English went ashore, easily captured the fort, and a bunch of cattle, aka hamburgers. People stepping off the Breukelen ferry told Director-General Stuyvesant that the English town's residents were organizing into companies of foot soldiers, and sailors from a Dutch boat anchored in Gravesend Bay reported the English ships had fired on them. Stuyvesant, stomping around the fort, sent a letter to the English intruders. What were they doing here? Stuyvesant was not apt to entertain anything of prejudice intended against us. The Director-General received Nichols' reply the following morning, saying that, in His Majesty's name, I do demand the town situate upon the island commonly known by the name of Manhattoes, with all the forts thereunto belonging, to be rendered unto His Majesty's obedience and protection into my hands. The king did not relish the effusion of Christian blood, but if the Dutch did not surrender, they would invite the miseries of a war. At the same time, the English sent proclamations far and wide, promising that no one was harmed as long as they quietly submitted to His Majesty, King Charles II. Farmers were forbidden from sending any supplies to the Dutch garrison on pain of having their homesteads burned down. Stuyvesant had a calm reaction to the letter. He returned it. It was missing a signature. Ooh, petty. I like that. Nichols immediately sent another letter, these to the Honorable Governor of the Manhattoes. If you noticed, not New Netherland. Honored Sir, the neglect of signing this enclosed letter when it was first brought to your hands by Colonel George Cartwright was an omission which is now amended, and I must attribute the neglect of it at first to the over-hasty zeal I had dispatching my answer to the letter I received from you dated 19th 26th instant. I have nothing more to add, either in matter or form than is therein expressed, only that your speedy answer is necessary to prevent future inconveniences, and will very much oblige your affectionate humble servant, Richard Nichols. On Saturday, Colonel Nichols sent a 4-man delegation led by Governor Winthrop Jr. to Fort Amsterdam. They asked for a meeting under a flag of truce, and Stuyvesant led them to a tavern. Winthrop urged his friend to surrender and handed him a letter containing Nichols's terms. Stuyvesant returned to the fort to read it. I do assure you that if the Manhattoes be delivered up to His Majesty, I shall not hinder but any people from the Netherlands may freely come and plant there or thereabouts, and such vessels of their own country may freely come thither, and any of them may as freely return home in vessels of their own country, and this and much more is contained in the privilege of His Majesty's English subjects. They were generous terms, extravagant almost, and yet the Director-General was unmoved. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but Stuyvesant, ever calm, now had all the information he needed, and it was probably hopeless, but he didn't doubt his course of action. He would not surrender. The West India Company would have him for breakfast. No, they would fight to the death. The English, waiting for Stuyvesant's reply, were like, "Take all the time you need. It's not like you're going anywhere." New Amsterdam was buzzing with rumors that a flag of truce had arrived. The citizens sent Director-General Stuyvesant a 3-man delegation to demand to see the letter he'd received from the English. Threats were uttered, curses were spoken, everyone believed resistance was futile, a mutiny was brewing. Stuyvesant personally attended the town meeting the following day. He tried to convince the men that they had no right to read the letter, but the citizens, fearing an imminent bombing of the town, refused to listen to Stuyvesant yakking on about who was in charge. Not anymore. Then, a little later, the schepenen at City Hall demanded to see the letter. The director flat out refused. Residents couldn't get such intelligence for security reasons. Some might blab important information about the defense of the town to the English. Dude, a few months ago, you told John Winthrop Jr. all about this. You revealing all to the governor of Connecticut. Stuyvesant knew his people. Once they heard the favorable terms, they'd let the English right on in. He needed them to put up a fight. When the council insisted, the enraged Director-General tore up the letter and stomped on it under his foot. Everyone went nuts. This was the final straw. All the long-suppressed rage came rushing out. The company, Stuyvesant, his council, all frauds. They always had been. For years they had sent requests, presented petitions, lodged complaints. But had he listened? No. He pooh-poohed them away, dismissing them as mere children who couldn't possibly understand the grown-up business of government. Peg-Leg Pete had been nothing but a good soldier, blindly carrying out the orders of a bankrupt bureaucracy. And now he had the audacity to expect them to fight and die on his orders? Why should they? Why should they spill their blood to defend the town the company had abandoned years ago? A company which even now, in their hour of need, ignored the Director-General's request for troops and money? Finally, Stuyvesant yielded. He awkwardly gathered up the pieces and handed them to Nicasius de Seal, who carefully pasted the letter back together, which was then read to the people. And yes, as Stuyvesant had guessed, they wanted to capitulate immediately. Meanwhile, Colonel Nichols decided that Director-General Stuyvesant's non-answer deserved a bit of a reaction. He dropped off some foot and horse on Brooklyn, Long Island, to team up with the Connecticut pike and musketmen and volunteers from the English villages. When some French privateers in the area heard it was going down, they rushed to join them. Then the colonel ordered the fleet to move closer through the Narrows until 2 were within cannon range of the city. Their fuses were lit, with the gunners standing by their combined 66 loaded cannons. The other 2 frigates were ready to move in to add another 28 guns to the fight. Stuyvesant stood on Fort Amsterdam's walls watching the 2 ships move closer. This was it. Both the city's future and the lives of its citizens hung in the balance. A lone gunner stood at Stuyvesant's side, waiting for his order to light the powder. One cannonball volley would take the vessels out, but the response of the other two would be swift and deadly. The city and everyone in it would go down in flames. Also, once Stuyvesant fired a single shot from the city walls, the besiegers were allowed to plunder everything once the place was conquered. But the Director-General couldn't just surrender to 4 frigates without a fight. It was surrender or die. Stuyvesant was about to open fire when the city's 2 reverends, Johannes Megapolensis and his son, approached him. We don't know the details of the discussion, but their pleas worked. Stuyvesant stepped off the rampart, left 50 men in charge of defending the fort, and took the rest of the garrison 100 men to fight off the English should they attempt a landing. The Director-General hoped that perhaps, maybe, they could strike a deal. That night, he sent a vessel silently through Hell Gate with a brief message to the West India Company directors in Amsterdam. Long Island is gone and lost. The capital cannot hold out long. Director-General Stuyvesant spent most of the night drawing up a firm response to Colonel Nichols' message. He wrote about the history of New Netherland from its earliest beginnings under the New Netherland Company in 1614 until the present day. The Dutch were the rightful owners of the place because of discovery, charter, settlement, and purchase from the Indians. He strongly disagreed with the English argument that His Britannic Majesty had an indisputable right to all the lands in the north parts of America, saying that we are obliged to defend our place. Perhaps Nichols should check with the Home Office first, there is peace now. He also claimed the king was ill-informed and would never have allowed this mission. In conclusion, he said, "In case you will act by force of arms, we protest before God and man that you will perform an act of unjust violence. You will violate the Articles of Peace solemnly ratified by His Majesty of England and my lords the States General. As regards to your threats, we have no answer to make, only that we fear nothing but what God may lay upon us. All things are at His disposal, and we can be preserved by Him with small forces as well as by a great army." While it was a bluff, Stuyvesant was not wrong in thinking this move by the English was rash. But while the Dutch had all the rights, the English had all the force, and, well, rights go out the window when force is knocking at the door. And indeed, the king was ill-informed, not about the colony, but by the English ambassador for the Netherlands, George Downing, who claimed the Dutch had no money and he could talk him out of declaring war. The Dutch had money, and they would fight to defend their interests, both home and abroad. In fact, at this very moment, Dutch Vice Admiral Michiel Adriaanszoon de Ruyter was preparing to launch an expedition to take back the lost trading post in West Africa from the English. And he would succeed. The new Amsterdam city government, the clergy, and the commanders of the citizens' militia all assembled in the city hall. 93 of them, including Stuyvesant's son Nicholas, drew up an earnest complaint, which was presented to the Director-General and his council. They were on the verge of mutiny. This had to be merely the vanguard of the English fleet. More ships would come. The city had no means to withstand a siege. By the rules of war, it meant the besieged only had one option: surrender. If Stuyvesant held out despite having all the odds against him and no hope of relief, New Amsterdam would be destroyed. But all of New Netherland, especially those settlements and lone farms along the river banks, would be doomed along with it. The palisade wall offered little protection, and Fort Amsterdam could fend off arrows or musket shots, not cannon fire from the ships. They only had gunpowder for 1 hour's worth of firing in store. The city had no food stores, and the fort didn't have a water well. New Amsterdam had some 2,500 residents, of which about 250 could bear arms. The garrison had 150 regulars. But most soldiers were not the cream of the crop. Their drills had lapsed, and having come from all over Europe, they felt no particular loyalty to the Dutch. They'd probably surrender after the first volley and might even join the English in the Plunder Fest. In fact, one of them was heard saying to an enthusiastic crowd, "Now we hope for a chance to pepper these devilish Dutch traitors. They have salted us too long. We know where their booty is stored, and we know also where the young girls live who wear gold chains." The Director-General cursed this melting pot force. What did I tell you? A mixed society, weakened nations. However, at this critical point, the residents of New Netherland turned their backs on the company, which had long since turned its back on them. Faced with this crowd, the Director-General had no choice but to yield. Director-General Stuyvesant sent 4 of the most distinguished officers of state with a flag of truce to Colonel Nichols. Through them, he said, "I feel obliged to defend the city in obedience to orders. It is inevitable that much blood will be shed on the occurrence of the assault. Cannot some accommodation yet be agreed upon? Friends will be welcome if they come in a friendly manner." Colonel Nichols' reply was brief, firm, and insulting. "I have nothing to do but to execute my mission. To accomplish that, I hope to have further conversation with you on the morrow at the Manhattans. You say that friends will be welcome if they come in a friendly manner. I shall come with ships and soldiers, and he will be bold indeed who will dare to come on board my ships to demand an answer or to solicit terms. What then is to be done? Hoist the white flag of surrender, and then something may be considered." This arrogant message caused major panic all over town. Men, women, and children begged with tears in their eyes that the Director-General submit. Even a short cannonade would kill hundreds and turn the city into a heap of ash. The Director-General replied, "I had rather be carried a corpse to my grave than to surrender the city." But he named 6 men to meet their English counterparts and negotiate terms. On September 6, 1664, at 8 o'clock in the morning, all parties met at Director-General Stuyvesant's residence on his farm. As was common at that time, neither Stuyvesant nor Colonel Nichols were present. Their chosen commissioners did the job. Stuyvesant sent 4 Dutchmen, 1 Englishman, and 1 Frenchman. Nichols' representatives were 2 of his aides and 4 New Englanders, including John Winthrop. We don't have details of the negotiations, but it is clear from the terms they agreed on that Stuyvesant fought hard for his people to keep rights and liberties, despite him never wanting them to have them, having fought the late Adriaan van der Donck all the way there. Behind his stern glare lurked a father's heart. Papa Stuyvesant cared for his people and used his negotiating power to secure the best deal for his children and prevent the English from reorganizing the lot. Nichols' private instructions from the king authorized him to inform the Dutch colonists only that they shall continue to enjoy all their possessions, forts only excepted, and the same freedom in trade with our other good subjects in those parts. But Stuyvesant appears to have instructed his men to push for specific guarantees, and that's what they got. The Articles of Capitulation, with 23 stipulations, is a remarkably detailed document, which included a guarantee of rights not found in any English colony. All of New Netherland was given to the English, but the Dutch kept their property, though they could leave the colony if they wanted to. Trade was guaranteed, and, most importantly, the Dutch here shall enjoy the liberty of their consciousness in divine worship and church discipline. And, in future, the town of Manhattan shall choose deputies, and those deputies shall have free voices in all public affairs. Another article stated that the townsmen of the Manhattans shall not have any soldier quartered upon them, another inspiration for the United States Bill of Rights, and no one from New Netherland would be forced to serve in a war against anyone. It is possible that this unusual slate of freedoms was authorized by King Charles's brother, James the Duke of York himself, who had declared he wanted the Manhattanites to have immunities and privileges beyond what other parts of my territory do enjoy. The next day was Sunday. These articles were therefore not ratified until 8 o'clock Monday morning. It was agreed that within 2 hours after the ratification, the fort and town called New Amsterdam upon the island of Manhattan was handed over. So, that fateful Monday morning, the 54-year-old former Director-General for New Netherland, Pieter Stuyvesant, led a military procession out of the fort. The officers and soldiers marched with their weapons, beating drums and flying colors. Then, on the waterfront, Nichols and his main force came ashore, and a small party of English soldiers entered the deserted fort. The English flag was raised, and Nichols declared the fort was now called Fort James. New Netherland was now New York, and New Amsterdam was renamed New York City for its patron, James the Duke of York, and Albany. Colonel Nichols became James's deputy governor, administering the vast territory that Britain had unjustly seized. Nichols, thrilled to bits about the bloodless takeover, gloated to the Duke that New York was the best of all His Majesty's towns in America, and predicting that within 5 years it would be the main port for the flow of trade between England and North America. When the news reached King Charles, he sent a letter to his sister in France, Henrietta, the Duchess of Orleans, King Louis XIV's sister-in-law. You will have heard of our taking of New Amsterdam, which lies just by New England. 'Tis a place of great importance to trade and a very good town. The Dutch had done marvels with the wilderness island, but we have got the better of it, and 'tis now called New York. Colonel Nichols immediately sent an armed force up the river to seize Fort Orange, which was renamed Fort Albany after the Duke of York's second title. After those in Beverwijk, with its 1,000 inhabitants, the second largest town in New Netherland, were promised no one would be harmed, they surrendered their town. Shortly after, Jeremias van Rensselaer, the patroon of Renselaarswijk, swore an oath of loyalty to the Duke of York. Esopus also surrendered without a fight. Sir Robert Carr was sent to the Delaware region with 3 frigates to raise the English flag over New Amstel. At the fort, the garrison wanted to submit, but their commander, Alexander Hinojosa, didn't. The English ships fired and the fort was taken by storm, killing 3, wounding 10 defenders. Then Carr took out his wrath on the settlement. Director-General Stuyvesant wrote, "At New Amstel on the South River, notwithstanding they offered no resistance, but demanded good treatment, which however they did not obtain, they were invaded, stripped bare, plundered, and many of them sold as slaves in Virginia." This testimony is corroborated by a London document which says, "The Dutch soldiers were taken prisoner and given up to the merchantman that was there in payment for his services, and they were transported to Virginia to be sold." The town of Plokhoy, near the former Zwanendal patroon ship, suffered a similar fate. In May 1663, the idealistic Pieter Corneliszoon Plokhoy and 41 other Mennonites had established a democratic settlement there, with yearly elections, no slavery, and no established religion. Quoting from the same London report, "Even the inoffensive Mennonists, though thoroughly non-combatant from principle, did not escape the second plunder to which the whole river was subjected by Carr and his co-marauders. A boat was dispatched to their settlement, which was stripped of everything, even to a very nail." New Amstel became Newcastle, and despite Lord Baltimore's claims on the area, the Duke of York ignored the charter and kept it until it was handed over to William Penn in 1682. Colonel Nichols at New Amsterdam paid more respect to the terms of the treaty. Its citizens were not robbed of their private property, but the West India Company officers had all their property mercilessly confiscated. Colonel Nichols grabbed anything he could get his hands on, desperate to destroy any and all traces of the old regime. Historians all seem to agree. This act of the English government was treacherous, unjust, violent, a breach of private justice and public faith. The Dutch had sheltered the King of England during his exile. Thanks for nothing, pal. Shortly after the surrender, Director-General Stuyvesant was called back to the Republic to account for his actions. Governor Pieter Stuyvesant boarded het gekruiste hart, the crossed heart, to head to the Republic and make his case before the States General. The West India Company was pretty mad and violently condemned Stuyvesant for his behavior. "Come on, guys, that ain't exactly fair. You left the man hanging high and dry, and yet you criticize him for your own failings. Well, welcome to corporate." The directors in Holland wrote to Stuyvesant, "It is an act which can never be justified, that a Director-General should stand between the gabions and the mouths of 20 pieces of cannon, while the hostile frigates passed a fort and yet give no orders to prevent it. It is unpardonable that he should lend his ear to preachers and other chicken-hearted persons, demeaning himself as if he were willing to fire, and yet to allow himself to be led in from the bulwark between the preachers. When the frigates had sailed past, he became so troubled that he must then first go out to prevent their landing. The excuse that it was resolved not to begin hostilities is very poor, for the English had committed every hostile act. All in all, a scandalous surrender." The severest charges were brought against him, but Stuyvesant presented to the States General an account of the circumstances preceding the surrender of New Netherland. He declared he had done everything in his power to keep the colony together. It was a triumphant vindication of his conduct, but neither the company nor the government cared. The Republic got their fifis hurt with the loss of its North American possessions. Stuyvesant petitioned to be allowed to return to his home. He'd become an American. While the company kept him trapped in Holland, eventually the States General granted him permission to return. The general lived out his life in the thriving settlement, where he was a respected farmer and grandpa, at last accepted in society. Pieter Stuyvesant died in 1672, aged 60, a New Yorker, and his remains are entombed at his chapel in the Bowery, now St. Mark's Church. So, is this the end of the tale of New Amsterdam? Oh no. Oh hell no. The Dutch Empire wasn't about to let the British Empire get away with any of this. To the ships! So, the English were on a roll. They had completed Phase 1 of their Operation Destroy Dutch Trade by swiping the slaving posts in West Africa, Phase 2 by swiping the New Netherland colony, and it was time for Phase 3, bring down the Dutch government and with it their trade. Ambassador George Downing planned to exploit the internal conflicts between supporters of Grand Pensionary or Prime Minister Johan de Witt and supporters of King Charles's nephew Willem III of Orange, aka Republicans and Orangists. These parties were at each other's throats all the time. They could never unite and agree to declare war, allowing the English to take everything and make Prince Willem the Republic's sovereign leader. That's what you get when you have a decentralized government and not an absolutist king. Suckers. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Michiel de Ruyter raided the Caribbean and recaptured the Guinea post, which forced the Royal African Company into bankruptcy. The RAC investors fumed, "War!" The English didn't want to start it because they believed King Louis XIV of France would only trigger the treaty with the Dutch if England declared war. So they would lure them into declaring war by attacking the Dutch merchant convoys. That didn't work. Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt, though mad about the attacks and the loss of New Netherland, didn't want to start a war either. Then, on March 4th, 1665, the English, mad that the Dutch, those two-legged cheese worms, had given orders to all the trading posts to kill all the English, declared war. The English had the better fleet, so they were favored to win. But the Republic, divided as it was, had in fact a sovereign, named Trade. And those states with not much skin in the trade game relied on Holland's cash to fight off the warmongery Prince Bishop of Münster, Christoph Bernhard von Galen, who was threatening the eastern border. Also, the Republic was about to launch its newly built 60 BASs, big-ass ships, and England didn't have the funds to keep up. However, on June 13, 1665, these BAS ships weren't ready yet, and during the Battle of Lowestoft, the Dutch Navy, out with their largest fleet ever, suffered the worst defeat in its history. They lost 16 ships and over a third of their personnel were either killed or captured. Commander-in-Chief Jacob van Wassenaar-Opdam didn't survive his ship blowing up either. After this defeat, the Dutch switched tactics and command structures. Some captains were dismissed or executed for cowardice. Michiel de Ruyter was appointed the new commander of the fleets. The Lieutenant Admiral immediately implemented the line battle formation and began training specialized sailors for amphibian actions, founding the Dutch Marine Corps. Meanwhile, England paid Bernhard von Galen to invade the Republic from the east. Von Galen's troops quickly overran the states of Overijssel and Drenthe and threatened Groningen. No one, especially the army, was prepared for this. The reputation of de Witt and Holland tanked immediately. Orangists figured the 15-year-old Prince Willem of Orange should lead the army like his ancestors had, but Johan de Witt was unwilling to give the prince an army. Fortunately, in August, the VOC spice fleet fought off the English in the Battle of Oggen. Now the Dutch had money to fight Bernhard von Galen. Meanwhile, English forces captured the Dutch islands of Sint Eustatius, Sabo and Tobago in the Caribbean. But neither country wanted a long war, and the Dutch tried to start negotiations. Peace in exchange for the New Netherland colony and some trading posts in West Africa then. But King Charles was riding high on victory and wanted everything! Then, oops, on January 16, 1666, King Louis of France, worried an English victory would destabilize Europe, activated his treaty with the Dutch and declared war on England. Louis also handed Denmark-Norway a big wad of cash to declare war on England as well. They closed the Baltic trade route to English ships, which now had to get their naval supplies elsewhere. France sent help to stop Bernard von Galen in his tracks, and when the Prince Bishop realized England had no money to pay him, von Galen quickly made peace with the Republic and left. The Republic launched 30 new BAS warships, most carrying up to 72 guns. In the 4 days' battle, the Dutch pummeled the English, who withdrew. But the Royal Navy was not nearly as damaged as the Dutch had hoped and won the strategically pointless St. James's Day battle. The English didn't have enough ships to blockade the Dutch coast, so instead, Robert Holmes attacked a merchant fleet moored near Harlingen Harbour. 150 Dutch merchantmen were destroyed, and the English brazenly plundered Westerschelling. The Dutch's outrage at this Holmes's bonfire was massive. Meanwhile, with France in the game, the Dutch launched a counterattack in the Caribbean. In August 1666, the Dutch first recaptured Tobago, and in November, together with the French, they recaptured St. Eustatius. Later that month, the French captured the English island of Antigua, but left it to the Dutch. Everyone believed that the Dutch fleet was going to retake New Netherland next. Meanwhile, London was going through some things. The Great Plague of London killed more than a quarter of its population, and in September 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed a chunk of the city. The economic damage was massive, and the English wondered, war, what is it good for? London merchants could no longer bankroll King Charles's navy, and when parliamentary red tape delayed money for repairs and such, the Navy Board had to fire many sailors without paying them. The Royal Navy was taken out of service and anchored at the naval base of Chatham, leaving the English merchant fleet to fend for themselves. Amid all these disasters, King Charles had no choice but to start peace talks with the Dutch in Breda. Meanwhile, Zeeland sent Admiral Abraham Krijnsen with a force to the Caribbean. In March 1667, he captured Suriname from the English. In May, Krijnsen teamed up with the French to invade Nevis, but because of French incompetence, the Battle of Nevis was repelled by a smaller English force. This Nevis battle was the first and only time where all three navies fought. After this failed attack, an angry Krijnsen sailed north. The admiral arrived unnoticed in the Chesapeake Bay and seized a heavily armed merchantman and another ship sailing out of the Hudson River. They told them that a ton of merchant ships filled with tobacco were further up the James River in Virginia. Krijnsen hoisted an English flag as a disguise, and in the Battle of the James River captured 18 very surprised merchantmen and some 6 tons of tobacco, and burned the warship Elizabeth. In New York, Governor Richard Nicolls had to adjust to life in the former Dutch colony. He reluctantly eased up on his strict rules so the colony could thrive. While the Dutch stopped coming, the English arrived in droves because, well, the people had more rights in New York than in New England. When rumors flew that a Dutch fleet was coming to retake New York, the whole town was in a tizzy. Suddenly, the colonists opened a few drawers and, oh hey, that's where they'd left their patriotism. When Governor Nicolls realized the rumors were true, he was like, oh crap, gather round folks, we gotta repair the fort and build new ones. Yeah, no one was gonna help him. If they hadn't wanted to experience the miseries of war under Director-General Stuyvesant, they certainly weren't interested in doing the same under some random Englishman. No one publicly cheered about the oncoming fleet. That would be treason, and treason meant death. Instead, they just shrugged and gave all the excuses why they couldn't help the governor. I have a bad back, leg, ingrown toenail. All Governor Nicolls could offer was power and wealth. Naturally, several Dutch citizens were happy ingratiating themselves and helped Nicolls, but they were few. The majority assumed an air of indifference. In their hearts, they hoped the Dutch fleet would arrive with an overwhelming force, making resistance futile. But the rumored fleet never arrived, because weather. Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt needed some leverage in the Anglo-Dutch peace talks, so he wanted to land a final massive blow to the English. He sent his brother Cornelis to the Dutch fleet with secret orders. On June 14, 1667, Lieutenant Admiral Michiel de Ruyter and 1,000 Marines sailed toward England with 3 squadrons of 62 frigates, about 15 lighter ships and 12 fire ships. Not everyone was immediately on board once Cornelis revealed the secret plans, but de Ruyter said, "Orders are orders," and eventually everyone fell in line. Spies warned the English government of the pending attack, but the English didn't prepare. Sure, a few folks might land on the coast, but they wouldn't dare land anywhere near London. Well, that was actually the plan. The Dutch would land the Marines at Chatham and destroy the English fleet laid up there. On June 19th, late in the afternoon, the English saw a Dutch squadron of 30 ships on the Thames. They sent a message to the Admiralty: "We're doomed! Doomed!" The Dutch sent a few landing parties ashore on the Kent and Essex side with strict orders not to plunder. Of course they plundered. Payback for Holmes's bonfire. They were driven off by the English and were punished when they got back on board. King Charles finally instructed Admiral George Monk, Duke of Albemarle, to go to Chatham to do something. After shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, sending cannons to all the wrong places, the guns ended up in Chatham to protect the 6-inch thick iron chain laid across the Medway that protected the English fleet. But the English troops were in a state of shock, and they had no powder, no ball, and with all the orders and counter-orders, no one knew what they were doing. Meanwhile, the oncoming Dutch forced the English further back up the Thames, who then sank their own ships in front of the Medway chain. The Dutch ships bore straight down on the chain, lost some of their own vessels when they hit the debris, but sank a few English ships beyond it. According to eyewitnesses, a group of Dutch marine engineers landed to break the chain using hammers. But the more spectacular version, the one most often told, is that Jan van Brakel, the commander of the plundering soldiers, volunteered his men to sail across it to break the chain. He was the first to cross, but probably not the one to break it. That's the Marine Corps engineers. Hoorah! Panic spread among the Thames into London. The Dutch were coming and they were bringing the French. The Dutch fleet entered the Chatham dockyard and set fire to the largest ships. Most English crews who hadn't been paid for months abandoned their half-flooded ships, mostly without a fight. And so, 4 of the 8 75-cannon ships and 3 of the 4 largest big-ass ships were lost in this raid. When the crew ran from the flagship the Royal Charles, the victorious Dutch took the ship with them back to the Republic. Michiel de Ruyter, while late to participate in the actual raid, got all the rewards, but all admirals were hailed as heroes. The raid on the Medway destroyed the reputation of the English crown, and the Royal Navy lost close to £200,000. The Dutch, who lost 8 spent fireships and had some 50 casualties, didn't destroy the Chatham dockyard, but the English Navy wouldn't recover for years. The Royal Charles, too large for Dutch waters, was dry docked near Hellevoetsluis and became a tourist attraction. It was eventually scrapped in 1672, but part of its transom, bearing the English coat of arms, ended up on display in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. It's still hanging there. However, the Dutch hadn't been able to land substantial land forces in Britain, and the Battle of Landguard Fort ended in Dutch failure. King Charles was offended by the whole experience. How dare the Dutch have attacked a laid-up fleet while he was in peace negotiations? But this humiliation, added to all the disasters, meant London was close to rebellion, forcing King Charles to arrange a peace deal quickly. The Dutch, increasingly worried about the French advances in the Spanish Netherlands, agreed to deal. On July 31, 1667, the Treaty of Breda concluded peace between England and the Netherlands. Each could keep what they had taken. So England kept the former New Netherland colony, while the Dutch kept Tobago, Sint Eustatius, various West African trading posts, plus the valuable sugar plantations of Suriname. Wait, Caribbean property was worth more than an awesome port in North America? Yes it was. Because sugar and salt. England weakened the Navigation Act a little and now allowed Dutch ships to carry German goods to English ports. The Republic was jubilant and Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt came out on top. But no king likes a gloating commoner, and the kings of England and France teamed up to plot revenge. Johan de Witt, unaware of their scheming, was unstoppable. The Grand Pensionary forced the other 6 states to adopt Holland's Perpetual Edict of 1667, a treaty stating that they would never again have a stadtholder, nor could they become captains general. True freedom for the win. Except that the other states railroaded de Witt to add a clause that would allow Prince Willem of Orange to become commander-in-chief of the Dutch forces at some point in the future. The Orangists were unhappy with Johan de Witt. The man of the True Freedom Party had allowed the English to interfere in Dutch politics, and the Treaty of Breda was a slap in the face. He'd simply given them New Netherland. And, well, Prince Willem was about to come of age, and he was looking to get some power. De Witt quickly offered him a seat on the Council of State, but the prince was looking for more. So was France. Dutch merchants sold many of their precious goods on the French market, undermining the French merchants and manufacturers. So, King Louis XIV placed tariffs on imports from the Republic, mostly on sugar, a massive blow to the Amsterdam sugar refineries. From now on, France would refine its own sugar. Thank you very much. While the two largest trading empires were fighting, Louis would create his own. The French king kept adding more tariffs on Dutch overseas products, while he aggressively expanded France's international trade. Then he declared war on Spain and invaded the Spanish Netherlands, according to him, his Spanish wife's property, therefore his. The States General freaked out. Exports to France collapsed, and they could be invaded next. Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt looked for ways to save the Spanish Netherlands because once that crumbling wall fell, the Republic would be buried beneath it. No one wanted to help. But when King Carlos of Spain asked the Republic to help stop France, de Witt feared making an alliance with the Republic's old enemy would weaken his political position. Still, de Witt negotiated with Spain to scare France. In the end, Johan de Witt chose the least unattractive option and concluded the Triple Alliance with England and Sweden. They declared they'd negotiate a peace between France and Spain, but a secret clause promised mutual military support in case of an attack by France or Spain. King Louis accepted the deal proposed by the Triple Alliance, and in May 1668, France and Spain ended the War of Devolution. France returned most captured territory in the Spanish Netherlands to Spain, keeping only a few key places. De Witt hoped to improve relations with France, but during the talks, France led the Witt on. King Louis was fuming about the Dutch intervention. He launched a wide array of anti-Dutch policies, ordered attacks in the Caribbean, the East Indies, and the northern trade routes, and made allies with other anti-Dutch territories in Europe. From the border regions in Germany, where Dutch troops had been stationed since the 80 Years' War, to Sweden and England, undermining the Triple Alliance. In June 1670, England and France concluded the Treaty of Dover, a military alliance against the Republic. They agreed to break the Republic's monopoly, seize some of their land, several of their colonies, and punish them for being so nasty. King Charles, while suspicious of King Louis, was overjoyed. The Dutch government would fall, trade would collapse, and his nephew, Prince Willem of Orange, would be given all the power. All would be right with the natural world in which the royals ruled, not the ordinary people. Louis promised the King of England all the money so that Charles could ditch Parliament. Johan de Witt knew England and France were talking, but was unaware of the scale of their scheme. He wasn't too worried. The English people would never trust a Roman Catholic king. When he noticed both Republican and Orangist merchants started banding together against him, de Witt launched reciprocal tariffs on France and sent his brother Cornelis to Germany to end the fights with Köln and Münster. Cornelis failed. They allied with France. In early 1671, the King of England told the King of France about the secret military assistance clause in the Triple Alliance, and Louis blew a gasket. He would wipe the Republic off the map. The year 1672 is known in Dutch history as the disaster year. According to a Dutch saying, de regering radeloos, het volk redeloos en het land reddeloos. The government desperate, the people unreasonable, and the country beyond saving. After the Anglo-Dutch Wars wreaked economic havoc, people weren't so sure about what the Witt brothers called the true freedom. Having commoners in charge was all fine and dandy when everything was going well. Once there was a crisis, people still believed that only royals could save the day. At the end of the Second Anglo-Dutch War in 1667, the Dutch Navy had been the largest in Europe. However, the States General, worried about unleashing a third one, halved the naval budget and appointed King Charles's 21-year-old nephew, Prince Willem of Orange, as Captain General, the Commander-in-Chief of the States Army of 83,000 men and Captain Admiral of the Navy. A victory for the Orangists, a defeat for Johan de Witt. Prince Willem was like, make way, the House of Orange-Nassau coming to the rescue, again. King Charles, now in cahoots with and sponsored by France, didn't need Parliament's permission to start a war. In March 1672, he ordered an attack on a Dutch Levant Company convoy in the Channel, but Vice Admiral Cornelis Evertsen de Jonge gave the English what for, and the mission failed. 2 weeks later, England ditched the Triple Alliance Treaty, sided with France, and declared war on the Dutch. The Third Anglo-Dutch War. France declared war a week later, citing some very vague grievances. On May 18th, Bernhard von Galen, the Prince Bishop of Münster, also declared war, soon followed by Maximilian Heinrich von Bayern, the Elector of Köln. Bommen Berend, as von Galen was called on account of his excessive use of artillery, invaded Overijssel and Gelderland. On May 22, 1672, King Louis XIV of France crossed the Maas River north of Maastricht with an army of 118,000 foot and 12,500 horse, outnumbering the Dutch 4-1. Grand Pensionary de Witt was unable to counter these attacks. First, no money. Second, he was unwilling to give the Prince of Orange the large army he needed. The prince could use it against him. As a result, Willem had to pull men from city garrisons, leaving many towns practically defenseless. Naturally, the Orangists unleashed all the pamphlets, accusing de Witt and his dumb-as-a-bag-of-rocks regent government of handing over the country to the French, probably wanting to make the Republic Roman Catholic too. Traitors! Hang the lot of them! Meanwhile, de Witt built up the Dutch fleet. Lieutenant Admiral Michiel de Ruyter was unable to stop the massive English fleet led by the Duke of York from joining up with the inexperienced French and their wonky fleet. They went to Solbay to resupply, but de Ruyter, though outnumbered, attacked the Allied fleet. Because of French incompetence or sabotage, the jury is still out on that one, after the Battle of Solbay, the Dutch remained in control of their coastal waters, secured their trade routes, and ended hopes of an Anglo-French landing in Zeeland. The English fleet, with its flagship the Royal James burned to the waterline, was pretty much out of commission. Again. And de Ruyter's sailors and marines were sent out to the various garrison towns to defend the country on land. On June 12th, the French outflanked the Dutch defenses and crossed the Rhine River at Lobith, effectively breaking the IJssellinie, a defensive line along the IJssel River. Against the advice of Johan de Witt, the states of Holland wanted to open negotiations for a separate peace. He could keep some towns, and they'd throw in some money. King Louis found the offer too low and kept plowing his way into the Republic, capturing Arnhem, Amersfoort, Naarden, Utrecht and, with Münster, Zwolle and Kampen. The people simply stood down, and now these towns were Roman Catholic. The States General simply gave up on the IJssellinie, and Prince Willem was forced to retreat behind the Hollandse Waterlinie, a flood barrier that defended Holland. When the inundation stopped the French in their tracks, they headed south, plundering every town and outraging women in the occupied territories. When the city's mayors and schepenen fled, the French told them to come back, or else lose their jobs. Most didn't. The people, both Republican and Orangist, became enraged about the nigh treasonous behavior of the De Witt brothers and their wealthy, corrupt and uncaring Loevesteiner oligarchs. Riots involving men, women and children spread through all the major cities. In some towns, the people plundered the regents' houses and simply took over the government. They needed a stadtholder. They needed Prince Willem to step in. Ditch the Eternal Edict, now! Several assassination attempts on the De Witt brothers failed. Johan de Witt was wounded in one attack, leaving him out of commission for a month. The alleged suspect, Jacob van der Graaf, was arrested, tried and executed so fast that people became even more enraged. What was this even? The following day, several men tried to enter Cornelis de Witt's house in Dordrecht, but they were driven back by the militia. Meanwhile, King Louis's brother Philippe took Zutphen, and on June 30th, the French had advanced on Gorinchem. The Republic was doomed. The People's Movement finally destroyed the Eternal Edict of 1667. On July 2, 1672, Zeeland appointed Prince Willem of Orange as stadtholder of Zeeland. Holland followed suit the following day, arguing only the prince's uncle King Charles could save them from the French. Thus ended the first stadtholderless period. Because, of course, there'd be another. Meanwhile, Overijssel surrendered to Bernhard van Galen, who then took Coevorden and occupied Drenthe, but was unable to besiege Groningen because of flooding. King Louis, unable to enter Holland, seized Nijmegen. Now the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I and King Carlos II of Spain got involved. Neither wanted France to gain control over the Republic, the largest commercial power in Europe. Leopold arranged for Spanish troops to defend the Dutch forts 's-Hertogenbosch and Breda, so that their garrisons became available for the field army. Then the English showed up in Prince Willem's camp and offered him peace. He'd get the title Sovereign Prince of Holland. As long as France and Münster kept their conquests, he paid England for North Sea herring rights, and he allowed English garrisons to occupy Brielle, Sluis and Vlissingen. Willem pooh-poohed his uncle's bribe offer away. Meanwhile, Emperor Leopold invaded the Rhineland and Alsace, and the King of France had to send troops over to handle it. Then King Louis went home, leaving Commander François-Henri de Montmorency, Duc de Luxembourg, with 40,000 men in the Republic. Everything came to a standstill, but the people in Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht and Friesland were panicking, and amid this panic, the government fell. On August 4th, 1672, Johan de Witt, seeing the true freedom falling apart, with everyone turning against him, resigned as Grand Pensionary, hoping to de-escalate the situation. But his resignation did little to quench the people's rage. A week earlier, Johan's brother Cornelis had been arrested on suspicion of plotting an assassination of Prince Willem and was imprisoned in the Gevangenenpoort in The Hague. The judges deemed there was enough evidence to give Cornelis het scherpe examen, that is, torture to discover the truth. The interrogation lasted 3.5 grueling hours, during which Cornelis maintained his innocence. On August 13th, the court found him innocent, but guilty of something. We'll pencil something in later. But on his sentencing a week later, the judges hadn't come up with anything. So, with no charges given, something, perjury something, Cornelis was stripped of all his offices and banished from Holland for the rest of his life. Perhaps the judges worried about acquitting a De Witt brother while everyone was so mad. Cornelis planned to appeal, but when Johan came to collect his brother from the prison gate later that day, a rowdy crowd gathered. The cavalry of the prison guard was conveniently MIA, chasing a non-existent group of plundering peasants. The crowd, along with riled-up Orangist militiamen, dragged both brothers out of the prison. Cornelis tripped and had his head bashed in, and was then shot and stabbed with knives. Johan was shot to death in the back of his head. Both bodies were stripped, ripped open and hung upside down at the Groene Zootje, the town's execution place. Attackers carved some parts of the brothers' bodies to keep as souvenirs, but some ate them on the spot. To this day, it is unclear what role, if any, Prince Willem of Orange played in all this. He was with his troops in Alphen at the time of the attack, but some claim that a few of his men were seen in The Hague that day. The Orangist Caspar Fagel became the new Grand Pensionary, and the prince replaced many undesirable Loevesteiner regents with inexperienced and arguably even more corrupt pro-prince regents. Many Republican government officials fled the country, fearing the angry masses and a possibly vindictive prince, but Willem hadn't removed the men out of spite, but to calm down the people. And it worked. The rioting stopped. However, the wealthy elites were not pleased to see the prince gaining so much power so quickly, but everyone kept their mouths shut. The wars weren't over yet. Peace negotiations made little progress. The French and English demands were too outrageous for the Republic to even consider. They rejected it all and became even more fierce in their resistance, with the Prince of Orange recapturing towns left and right, because the Elector of Köln and the Bishop of Münster had to split their forces to defend their territory under attack back home. The French couldn't even cross the frozen Holland waterline, because the Dutch broke the ice and soldiers strapped on skates to fend off the French. But King Louis personally attended the capture of Maastricht. At sea, Lieutenant Admiral Michiel de Ruyter fought off the vastly superior English and French in the First and Second Battle of the Schoneveld and sent them packing after the Battle of Texel, prompting the Duke of York to say that among admirals, he was the greatest that ever to that time was in the world. Dutch privateers pummeled the English merchant fleet the world over, and King Charles couldn't get Parliament to give him money unless he accepted the Test Act, barring Catholics from public office. This Test Act forced James, the Duke of York, out of the closet as a Roman Catholic. The man had secretly converted to Roman Catholicism a few years earlier, and knowing he couldn't comply with the Test Act, he resigned as Lord High Admiral. King Charles, unhappy with James's religious switch and himself without legitimate heirs, demanded that his brother's daughters Mary, 11, and Anne, 8, be raised in the Church of England. The English people were unhappy with the two secretive Stuarts, James with his secret life as a Roman Catholic, and Charles with his recently leaked secret French deals. Parliament wanted peace. In December 1672, the Zeeland Admiralty sent out Vice Admiral Cornelis Evertsen de Jongste, not to be confused with his cousin Cornelis Evertsen de Jonge we met a little earlier, to plunder English ships returning from Asia. He captured the island of St. Helena to use as a base and spent 8 months looking for prey. At the end of his mission, he had orders to go to Suriname to unload goods. Once that was completed, he had to return to home base. So he didn't. He joined an Amsterdam squadron commanded by Jacob Binkes and sailed to Virginia, where they burned part of the Virginia tobacco fleet in the Second Battle of the James River. They captured a small English vessel, whose crew told them about the deplorable condition of Fort James and that New York's Governor Francis Lovelace wasn't home. Alright, we didn't expect this, hadn't prepared for this, and had no orders to do this, but let's go. On August 7, 1673, sails appeared off Sandy Hook. The 23-ship Dutch fleet had arrived. The Dutch locals, who came aboard for a little chat, pleaded with the commanders. Please save us. Everything was better than living under the English. It's possible Evertsen exaggerated the story a bit to justify to his superiors what he did next. The fleet quietly sailed up the bay, and mimicking the English fleet years before, anchored opposite the battery and turned their broadsides toward the city. Captain John Manning notified Governor Lovelace, who couldn't return for days. He tried to find recruits to defend the place, but no one was willing. The city was still mostly Dutch and delighted to see a Dutch flag in the harbor. They were like, "Come on in." Captain Manning had only some 70 soldiers within the fort. Half of them were rookies, and none were willing to endanger their lives for the flag of England. A few well-placed Dutch volleys would disable all the fort's cannons and send any surviving defenders running. One group even spiked several cannons of the battery opposite City Hall. My, how the tables have turned. The Dutch ships readied the cannons and sent a boat ashore, with a trumpeter bearing a flag of truce and a message. At the same time, Captain Manning sent a boat with commissioners to the ships. The boats passed each other without exchanging words. Captain Manning's boat bore a simple message to the Dutch commanders. Why do you come in such a hostile manner to disturb His Majesty's subjects in this place? Our countries are at war? Duh. Where is your commission? In one of the cannons. You'll be able to read it when we start blasting. The Dutch trumpeter delivered the following message to Fort James. The force of war now lying in your sight is sent by the High and Mighty States General and His Serene Highness the Prince of Orange for the purpose of destroying their enemies. We have sent you, therefore, this letter, together with our trumpeter, to the end that, upon the sight hereof, you surrender unto us the fort called James, promising good quarter, or, by your refusal, we shall be obliged to proceed, both by land and water, in such manner as we shall find to be most advantageous for the High and Mighty States. Captain Manning sent back a boat to tell the commanders, thanks for the message, I'll just wait for my officers to return before I give my final answer. The Dutch commanders were not here to parley. Our guns are locked and loaded and ready to fire. We want an answer in 1/2 hour, that is 30 minutes, from the moment your boat gets to the shore. If the hourglass runs out before the white flag is raised on the fort, the cannonade will commence. The last grains of sand fell in the hourglass, and no white flag appeared. Unleash the cannons! Cannonballs rained down on the feeble Fort James, plowing the ramparts, destroying barracks, and killing and wounding men. The volleys didn't let up. Captain Manning didn't return fire. He and his powerless garrison ducked for cover instead. During the cannonade, the Dutch commanders landed 600 soldiers armed with grenades and other weapons to storm the fort. They met no resistance, and the Dutch cheered them on as they marched. At nearly a mile north of the fort, Captain Anthony Colve got his men in formation to march on the town. Captain Manning sent 3 subordinate officers to Colve to parley, but they had no proposals, nothing to offer. What? They detained 2 men and sent the 3rd officer, Captain Carr, back to tell the English commander that if he didn't surrender the place in 15 minutes, it would be taken by storm. Carr didn't venture back into the town with his report, but fled into the interior of the island. The Dutch troops headed up Broadway, but the trumpeter sent to get an answer from Manning returned saying that he had received no summons. Captain Colve spat, "They are not to play the fool with us in this way. Forward march!" Colve and his men marched in formation down Broadway with the drums beating, trumpets sounding, and banners flying to the cluster of about 300 houses at the extreme southern point of the island. Colve had the 2 detained English commissioners march in front of his troops. The whole thing looked and felt like a massive invasion force. When Captain Manning saw them coming, he sent another flag of truce to the Dutch commander. He was ready to surrender the fort with all its arms and ammunition if the officers and soldiers could march out with their private property and to the music of their band. These terms were accepted. The English left the fort, and the Dutch entered and raised the Dutch banner on the ramparts. The people were spared, there was no plunder, and the city government was changed. Captain Manning was severely censured by the people of the English colonies in America and by the home government. How could he be fired on and not return a single shot? The captain was court-martialed for cowardice and treachery. He was condemned. His sword was broken over his head, and he was declared incompetent forever to hold any station of trust or authority under the government. Governor Lovelace was condemned for neglect of duty. He received a severe reprimand, and the Duke of York confiscated all his property. The victorious Dutch commanders appointed Captain Anthony Colve as governor of recaptured New Netherland. They renamed New York New Orange and Fort James Fort Willem Hendrik, Prince Willem's full name. A ton of money was spent on repairing and improving the fortifications so that no English fleet would dare come near them. The place became a military post with a municipal government. Nearly every citizen was trained to bear arms, and troops were drilled daily at the common. Never would they surrender the city without firing a gun. Well, it was surrendered with the stroke of a pen. The States General freaked out when they heard Admiral Johan Evertsen de Jongste had recaptured their old colony. That was never the plan. It might upset everything in Europe. Spain might not help them now. While the peace talks continued, the States General received a letter from New Orange desperately asking for help to keep the Dutch colony, but the letter was ignored. They were too busy waging war and talking peace to worry about their abandoned colony. Meanwhile, pamphlets circulated in England saying that King Charles and King Louis were conspiring to make the country Roman Catholic again. Many believed this, especially when Charles gave permission to his heir, the recently widowed James, the Duke of York, to marry Maria of Modena, a 15-year-old Italian Roman Catholic. Some called for Prince Willem of Orange, King Charles I, his grandson, the True Stuart, to become king once Charles died and exclude the Duke of York. When Spain joined the fight against the French, Prince Willem had room to attack. In September, he recaptured Naarden. Then the Dutch and Imperial forces attacked Köln, forcing the French to withdraw from the waterline. Münster was forced to make peace, and Bommenberend had to surrender all his gained territory. With Parliament no longer willing to fund the war, King Charles told the French he had to tap out. He told the Dutch that his main goal, getting his nephew his stadtholderate, had been achieved. He wanted a lasting peace, and some cash. On January 4, 1674, the States General of the Netherlands drafted a final peace proposal, which was discussed in the English Parliament and approved. In February 1674, King Charles signed the Second Treaty of Wstminster. On March 5th, with remarkable speed, the States General ratified it. The Third Anglo-Dutch War was over. All the people and all the trading companies rejoiced. Most of the peace conditions demanded by the English were not met, but all seized lands, ports, and towns during this war would be returned. So the Dutch got their Caribbean islands back, but New Orange, formerly New York, formerly New Netherland, became English again. It took a while before the rest of the world knew there was peace, so some fighting continued. And it took several months for New Orange to be surrendered. The Dutch also had to pay an indemnity of 2 million guilders, down from the original demand of 10 million to be paid over 3 years. But Prince Willem forced Uncle Charles to pay off his father's debt to the House of Orange when they supported him, leaving Charles with very little. The prince also convinced Charles to let him marry James's Protestant daughter and heir, Mary, to save Protestant England from a Roman Catholic takeover under his brother. In 1678, France at last made peace in the Peace of Nijmegen, a series of treaties ending all the interconnected wars. While France gained territories in the Spanish Netherlands, the Dutch kept their independence and borders and repaired trade relations with France. But Willem warned everyone that King Louis would remain a threat, and the states needed to maintain the Republican armies. But the States General, and mainly Holland, didn't want to listen. Stadtholder Willem was already far too powerful. Okay, so we're done now, right? Right? Not quite. Like the final installment of the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy, we're not done waving goodbye to the story of New Amsterdam just yet. On February 6, 1685, King Charles died, and the Duke of York was like, I'm about to make a name for myself up in here. The leaders of the three kingdoms backed King James II's ascension. Sure, he was probably a popish puppet, but as long as he maintained the Protestant church, everything should be fine. Also, James and Maria had no children, and since his heirs were his Protestant daughters, everything should be fine. Everything was not fine. King James crushed Protestant revolts in Scotland and England, alienating his base, and he destabilized Ireland. Speaking of Protestant crushing, in October 1685, King Louis of France ditched the 1598 Edict of Nantes, which had allowed Protestants to practice their religion in France. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots were forced into exile. In November 1685, James wanted to introduce freedom of religion in his kingdoms, mainly for the benefit of the Roman Catholics, in what would become the Declaration of Indulgence. Parliament was like, no. So, the king suspended Parliament. God-sanctioned authoritarian rule was back on the menu, boys. The clergy who refused to read the indulgence out loud were arrested and put on trial. It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him. So it didn't. Prince Willem of Orange, the king's nephew and son-in-law, could hear France's war drums coming far off in the distance when King Louis announced tariffs on Dutch imports again, ripping up the Peace of Nijmegen. The prince wanted his uncle to join him and fight France, but James wanted to remain neutral. However, when King James recalled all English and Scottish troops in the state's army, the Dutch feared a Roman Catholic Anglo-French alliance, a repeat of the Third Anglo-Dutch War. So, Prince Willem had been right all along, but some hoped it was just a phase. It wasn't. On June 10, 1688, King James's wife Maria gave birth to James Francis Edward Stuart, a potential Roman Catholic heir. That same month, 7 bishops imprisoned for not reading the Declaration of Indulgence out loud were acquitted, decimating James's rule. Some English cried out, "Prince Willem, we need you. Come to England, bring an army, and kick out James, please, pretty please." Willem was like, on my way. The House of Orange and us out to the rescue. Again. This would work out great for him and the Republic. He could help England, stop James II, restore the old order, and stop the King of France all in one fell swoop. But no, he would never take the crown. Wink, wink. The English figured the prince would come with a small army. Well, someone forgot to tell Willem. He assembled 250 ships and 15,000 men, nearly half the Dutch state's army. The States General were like, we're about to enter into a war with France here? Is this a good idea? And once Willem had access to English resources, Amsterdam's power in the Republic and its international trade status in the world would be ground to dust. Yeah, Amsterdam never liked them Orange Nassaus. Fortunately, France was tied up in Germany, and when the French Navy seized over 100 mainly Amsterdam merchant ships, Amsterdam told Willem, "Tear James a new one." The Dutch preparations were carried out fast, the fleet building to 400 ships with 40,000 men. King James had figured he was safe from invasion because of France's shenanigans, his awesome navy, and, well, the ex-admiral knew fall was a terrible time of year to launch a naval expedition. However, France was otherwise occupied, his awesome navy wasn't that awesome anymore, and, well, Protestant. Willing to fight for a Protestant heir, not so much for a Roman Catholic king. James started freaking out, trying to turn back the clock on his policies. Too late. On October 24th, 1688, after weather delayed its departure, the Dutch fleet got underway. The States fleet entered the English Channel in an impressive formation with ships 25 rows deep, with troops lined on the deck firing musket volleys and military music playing. The English fleet was outnumbered 2-1, undermanned, short of supplies, in the wrong place, and because of the wind, unable to move out. 2 days later, the stadtholder landed over 20,000 troops on the Devon coast. Well, hello there. While James dilly-dallied, Willem was careful not to shock the English too much and avoid bloodshed. There were 2 clashes worth mentioning between the Williamites and the Jacobites at Wincanton and Reading, but that's all she wrote. James fled to France as Willem rode triumphantly into London, greeted by cheering crowds. Since there was a general lack of fighting, Willem's power play was dubbed the Glorious Revolution. Stadtholder Willem became the King of England with his wife Queen Mary. They agreed to share power with Parliament, making England more of a constitutional monarchy. A Bill of Rights was introduced to protect the people's freedoms and limit the king's power, changing England forever. Under King William's leadership, England joined the Grand Alliance of Protestant nations against King Louis, and on May 5, 1689, England declared war on France, joining the 9 Years' War, which ended inconclusively 8 years later in 1697. Why did me telling you all this matter? Well, as you might have guessed, when Stadtholder Willem came to power in England, people thought King William would return New York to the Netherlands. So, did he? During his reign, King James II had established the Dominion of New England in the Americas and added New York and the Jerseys to it later. This new autocratic government was much despised, and when news of the Glorious Revolution broke, the New England colonies kicked out the Dominion's governor Sir Edmund Andros and his cronies and re-established their old governments. New York's Lieutenant Governor Francis Nicholson tried to distract the New Yorkers by telling them the Frenchies from Canada were coming for them. But no one wanted to pay the taxes to improve the defenses. The most vocal opponent was the wealthiest merchant/militia captain, Jacob Leisler. The German-born Calvinist, who had served as a West India Company man under then Director-General Pieter Stuyvesant, hated the Dominion regime and its Roman Catholic ambitions. Leisler's men occupied Fort James and would hold it until the new monarchs appointed a new governor. Nicholson fled to England, and Leisler shooed away the city's administration, who first set up shop in Albany but ultimately surrendered to Leisler. Meanwhile, King William appointed a new governor, Colonel Henry Slaughter, an Englishman. William apparently wasn't interested in breaking his treaty with himself and returning New York to the Dutch at the moment. Slaughter was delayed, and his lieutenant governor, Major Richard Ingoldsby, was first to arrive in January 1691. Because his papers were still on Slaughter's ship, Leisler didn't believe him, and Ingoldsby besieged Fort James. When Slaughter arrived, Leisler tried to make a deal, but Slaughter said, "I don't negotiate with my subjects," and ordered him arrested. Leisler surrendered, and he and his fellow Leislerians were put on trial and convicted for treason. Leisler and the main co-conspirator Jacob Milburn were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, and their estates confiscated. Leisler insisted that he acted for the glory of the Protestant interest, the establishment of the present government, and to protect the state from outside forces. After his execution, pro- and anti-Leislerians fights continued in the colony. Over the next few years, a pro-Leisler group managed to secure pardons for everyone, including Leisler. In 1691, Fort James, formerly Fort Amsterdam, Fort James, Fort Willem Hendrik, was renamed Fort William Henry. Then, on March 4th, 1702, the 51-year-old stadholder King William fell off his horse after it tripped over a molehill. The king broke his clavicle, after which he developed pneumonia. 2 weeks later, he died, and with him any hopes of the Republic getting back New Netherland. The king died without heirs, so the second stadholderless period began. But that's a story for another series. The New Netherland colony changed hands 5 times in 3 decades, but no matter who controlled them, its citizens never gave up their rights. The English didn't fix what was apparently not broken and adapted the Dutch culture instead. As a result, the Dutch transplanted concepts of tolerance, freedom, and diversity remained, and the many settlers coming in from all around Europe allowed New York to grow and flourish. It never lost its original West India Company function as a trading port. In the 18th century, New York was a central battleground of the American Revolution. The British held it for most of the conflict, but in 1789, under the new Constitution, it became the first capital of the United States, where George Washington was inaugurated as its first president. During the 19th century, immigration and industrialization saw New York grow quickly, securing its multicultural identity. Steven van Rensselaer, the last of the family to be called the Patroon, died in 1839. In 1898, the modern city of New York was formed, uniting Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island into one metropolis. During the 20th century, New York became a global center for finance, with Wall Street being the heart of the financial world. While the city faced challenges, like during the Great Depression in the 1930s and the events of September 11, 2001, New York remained, from its humble beginnings as New Amsterdam, a symbol of opportunity and diversity. Throughout history, historians claim that the Dutch colony in North America was inconsequential and played no role in the United States origin myth in which the English Puritans built it all from scratch. They were a chosen people who created a divinely anointed society, and they would bring this light to the rest of the world. Well, this light already shone brightly in the Netherlands. Most people today realize that the Puritans, though practical and plain-spoken, were also self-important zealots who insisted on a theocracy. They didn't want religious freedom and cracked down mercilessly on alternative views. The root cause of the myth is that all its documents were written in Dutch, so the English story prevailed. Then everything was shoehorned in to fit this narrative, from the Flushing Remonstrance, a Dutch legal concept, to the no taxation without representation. Both were causes of the 80 Years' War back in 1568. And no, New Netherland wasn't small. It covered the territory of 5 of the 13 colonies, and, well, Manhattan. The colony's principles and culture, which influence American culture today, were merely adapted by the English from the Dutch, such as the concept of a confederation of sovereign states, constitutional freedom, a representative municipal government, civil contracts, public stockholders, land ownership rights, the registration of transfers of real estate, and liberal doctrines in commercial enterprise. The Dutch introduced the ideas of freedom of the press, freedom of conscience and religion, and free public education to promote literacy and schooling. There was also public integrity, private virtue, and sympathy with subjects of oppression. For instance, when the 13 colonies declared independence from England, the Dutch regent stepped in with generous and timely assistance. Even the opening statement of the 1776 Declaration of Independence was copied from the Dutch Act of Abjuration from 1581. Familiar relics of the Netherlands in New York City remain, from the place names Staten Island, Harlem, Brooklyn, and Flushing, to its distinct architecture, like the high stoops, brick houses, gramble roofs, and step gables. There are other influences, such as the observance of New Year's Day and Santa Claus. On December 6th, children of Dutch families in New Amsterdam would wake to find that Sinterklaas, St. Nicholas, had left treats for them. The English, French, German, and Swedish families of Manhattan were pressured to buy their kids presents, and thus adopted the Dutch tradition, which was later pushed forward a couple of weeks to align with the festival of Christmas. When there was a grain shortage in the city, the municipal government ordered the bakers to restrict themselves to baking bread and not to bake any more koekjes. Notice the Dutch word, koekjes. The first Manhattanites called them that, and now Americans would never eat biscuits, but cookies. The New Amsterdam women finally chopped up cabbage, adding vinegar and melted butter to make coleslaw, cabbage salad. Today, it's the American staple coleslaw. There are other Dutch words that found its way into American English through the colony, such as boss, waffle, stoop, skipper, dock, yacht, bicker, furlough, quack, sleigh, booze, landscape, freebooter, spook, and of course Yankee, from Jan Kees or Janneke. In closing, several United States presidents came from prominent New Netherland families like Roosevelt, Schuyler, Van Cortlandt, Van Rensselaer, Van Valkenburg, and Van Tassel. The direct descendants were Martin van Buren, whose parents were both descendants of Dutch settlers and whose first language was Dutch, and the Roosevelts, who descended from Klaas Maartensen van Roosevelt, who hailed from Zeeland, the Netherlands. Those with more distant colonial ancestors were Warren G. Harding and the Bushes. Of course, the Dutch weren't the only early influencers on American culture. Please share in the comment section how descendants of your culture influenced American culture today.